Hello everyone, I'm Matthew Allen, and welcome back to What a Book. Today we continue onwards in Twilight, Chapter 10, Interrogations. It was very hard, in the morning, to argue with the part of me that was sure last night was a dream. Logic wasn't on my side, or common sense. I clung to the parts I couldn't have imagined, like his smell. I was sure I could never have dreamed that up on my own. It was foggy and dark outside my window, absolutely perfect. He had no reason not to be in school today. I dressed in my heavy clothes, remembering I didn't have a jacket, further proof that my memory was real. When I got downstairs, Charlie was gone again. I was running later than I'd realized. I swallowed a granola bar in 3 bites, chased it down with milk straight from the carton, and then hurried out the door. Hopefully the rain would hold off until I could find Jessica. It was unusually foggy. The air was almost smoky with it. The mist was ice cold where it clung to the exposed skin on my face and neck. I couldn't wait to get the heat going in my truck. It was such a thick fog that I was a few feet down the driveway before I realized there was a car in it. A silver car. My heart thudded, stuttered, and then picked up again in double time. I didn't see where he came from, but suddenly he was there, pulling the door open for me. "Do you want to ride with me today?" he asked, amused by my expression as he caught me by surprise yet again. There was uncertainty in his voice. He was really giving me a choice. I was free to refuse, and part of him hoped for that. It was a vain hope. "Yes, thank you," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. As I stepped into the warm car, I noticed his tan jacket was slung over the headrest of the passenger seat. The door closed behind me, and, sooner than should be possible, he was sitting next to me, starting the car. "I brought the jacket for you. I didn't want you to get sick or something." His voice was guarded. I noticed that he wore no jacket himself, just a light gray knit V-neck shirt with long sleeves. Again, the fabric clung to his perfectly muscled chest. It was a colossal tribute to his face that it kept my eyes away from his body. "I'm not quite that delicate," I said, but I pulled the jacket onto my lap, pushing my arms through the 2 long sleeves, curious to see if the scent could possibly be as good as I remembered. It was better. "Aren't you?" he contradicted in a voice so low I wasn't sure if he meant for me to hear. We drove through the fog-shrouded streets, always too fast, feeling awkward. I was, at least. Last night all the walls were down. Almost all. I didn't know if we were still being as candid today. It left me tongue-tied. I waited for him to speak. He turned to smirk at me. "What? No 20 questions today?" "Do my questions bother you?" I asked, relieved. "Not as much as your reactions do." He looked like he was joking, but I couldn't be sure. I frowned. "Do I react badly?" "No, that's the problem. You take everything so coolly. It's unnatural. It makes me wonder what you're really thinking." "I always tell you what I'm really thinking." "You edit," he accused. "Not very much. Enough to drive me insane." "You don't want to hear it," I mumbled, almost whispered. As soon as the words were out, I regretted them. The pain in my voice was very faint. I could only hope he hadn't noticed it. He didn't respond, and I wondered if I had ruined the mood. His face was unreadable as we drove into the school parking lot. Something occurred to me belatedly. "Where's the rest of your family?" I asked, more than glad to be alone with him, but remembering that his car was usually full. "They took Rosalie's car." He shrugged as he parked next to a glossy red convertible with the top up. "Ostentatious, isn't it?" Wow," I breathed. "If she has that, why does she ride with you?" "Like I said, it's ostentatious. We try to blend in." "You don't succeed." I laughed and shook my head as we got out of the car. I wasn't late anymore. His lunatic driving had gotten me to school in plenty of time. "So, why did Rosalie drive today if it's more conspicuous?" "Hadn't you noticed? I'm breaking all the rules now." He met me at the front of the car, staying very close to my side as we walked onto campus. I wanted to close that little distance, to reach out and touch him, but I was afraid he wouldn't like me to. "Why do you have cars like that at all?" I wondered aloud, "if you're looking for privacy." "An indulgence," he admitted with an impish smile. "We all like to drive fast." "Figures," I muttered under my breath. Under the shelter of the cafeteria roof's overhang, Jessica was waiting, her eyes about to bug out of their sockets. Over her arm, bless her, was my jacket. "Hey, Jessica," I said when we were a few feet away. Thanks for remembering." She handed me my jacket without speaking. "Good morning, Jessica," Edward said politely. It wasn't really his fault that his voice was so irresistible, or what his eyes were capable of. Hi?" She shifted her wide eyes to me, trying to gather her jumbled thoughts. "I guess I'll see you in Trig." She gave me a meaningful look, and I suppressed a sigh. What on earth was I going to tell her? "Yeah, I'll see you then." She walked away, pausing twice to peek back over her shoulder at us. "What are you going to tell her?" Edward murmured. "Hey, I thought you couldn't read my mind," I hissed. "I can't," he said, startled. Then understanding brightened his eyes. "However, I can read hers. She'll be waiting to ambush you in class." I groaned as I pulled off his jacket and handed it to him, replacing it with my own. He folded it over his arm. "So, what are you going to tell her?" "A little help," I pleaded. "What does she want to know?" He shook his head, grinning wickedly. "That's not fair." "No, you not sharing what you know. Now, that's not fair." He deliberated for a moment as we walked. We stopped outside the door to my first class. "She wants to know if we're secretly dating. And she wants to know how you feel about me," he finally said. Yikes. What should I say? I tried to keep my expression very innocent. People were passing us on their way to class, probably staring, but I was barely aware of them. He paused to catch a stray lock of hair that was escaping the twist on my neck and wound it back into place. My height spluttered hyperactively. "I suppose you could say yes to the first, if you don't mind. It's easier than any other explanation." "I don't mind," I said in a faint voice. "And as for the other question, well, I'll be listening to hear the answer to that one myself." One side of his mouth pulled up into my favorite uneven smile. I couldn't catch my breath soon enough to respond to that remark. He turned and walked away. "I'll see you at lunch," he called over his shoulder. 3 people walking in the door stopped to stare at me. I hurried into class, flushed and irritated. He was such a cheater. Now I was even more worried about what I was going to say to Jessica. I sat in my usual seat, slamming my bag down in aggravation. "Mornin', Bella," Mike said from the seat next to me. I looked up to see an odd, almost resigned look on his face. "How was Port Angeles?" It was... There was no honest way to sum it up. "Great," I finished lamely. "Jessica got a really cute dress." "Did she say anything about Monday night?" he asked, his eyes brightening. I smiled at the turn the conversation had taken. "She said she had a really good time," I assured him. "She did?" he said eagerly. "Most definitely." Mr. Mason called the class to order then, asking us to turn in our papers. English and then government passed in a blur, while I worried about how to explain things to Jessica and agonized over whether Edward would really be listening to what I said through the medium of just his thoughts. How very inconvenient his little talent could be, when it wasn't saving my life. The fog had almost dissolved by the end of the second hour, but the day was still dark with low, oppressing clouds. I smiled up at the sky. Edward was right, of course. When I walked into Trig, Jessica was sitting in the back row, nearly bouncing off her seat in agitation. I reluctantly went to sit by her, trying to convince myself it would be better to get it over with as soon as possible. "Tell me everything," she commanded before I was in the seat. "What do you want to know?" I hedged. "What happened last night?" He brought me dinner, and then he drove me home." She glared at me, her expression stiff with skepticism. "How did you get home so fast?" "He drives like a maniac. It was terrifying." I hoped he heard that. "Was it like a date? Did you tell him to meet you there?" I hadn't thought of that. "No. I was very surprised to see him there." Her lips puckered in disappointment at the transparent honesty in my voice. "But he picked you up for school today?" she probed. "Yes, that was a surprise too. He noticed I didn't have a jacket last night," I explained. "So, are you going out again?" He offered to drive me to Seattle Saturday because he thinks my truck isn't up to it. Does that count?" "Yes," she nodded. Well, then, yes." "Wow." She exaggerated the word into 3 syllables. "Edward Cullen." I I know. I agreed. Wow, didn't even cover it. Wait! Her hands flew up, palms toward me like she was stopping traffic. Has he kissed you? No, I mumbled. It's not like that. She looked disappointed. I'm sure I did too. Do you think Saturday? She raised her eyebrows. I really doubt it. The discontent in my voice was poorly disguised. What did you talk about? She pushed for more information in a whisper. Class had started, but Mr. Varner wasn't paying close attention, and we weren't the only ones still talking. I don't know, Jess. Lots of stuff, I whispered back. We talked about the English essay a little. A very, very little. I think he mentioned it in passing. Please, Bella, she begged. Give me some details. Well, okay. I've got one. You should have seen the waitress flirting with him. It was over the top, but he didn't pay any attention to her at all. Let him make what he could of that. That's a good sign, she nodded. Was she pretty? Very. And probably 19 or 20. Oh, even better. He must like you. I think so, but it's hard to tell. He's always so cryptic. I threw in for his benefit, sighing. I don't know how you're brave enough to be alone with him, she breathed. Why? I was shocked, but she didn't understand my reaction. He's so intimidating. I wouldn't know what to say to him. She made a face, probably remembering this morning or last night when he turned the overwhelming force of his eyes on her. I do have some trouble with incoherency when I'm around him, I admitted. Oh well, he is unbelievably gorgeous. Jessica shrugged as if this excused any flaws, which, in her book, it probably did. There's a lot more to him than that. Really? Like what? I wished I had let it go, almost as much as I was hoping he'd been kidding about listening in. I can't explain it right, but he's even more unbelievable behind the face. The vampire who wanted to be good, who ran around saving people's lives so he wouldn't be a monster. I stared toward the front of the room. Is that possible? She giggled. I ignored her, trying to look like I was paying attention to Mr. Varner. So you like him, then? She wasn't about to give up. Yes, I said curtly. I mean, do you really like him? She urged. Yes, I said again, blushing. I hoped that detail wouldn't register in her thoughts. She'd had enough with the single-syllable answers. How much do you like him? Too much, I whispered back. More than he likes me. But I don't see how I can help that. I sighed, one blush blending into the next. Then, thankfully, Mr. Varner called on Jessica for an answer. She didn't get a chance to start on the subject again during class, and as soon as the bell rang, I took evasive action. In English, Mike asked me if you said anything about Monday night, I told her. You're kidding! What did you say? She gasped, completely sidetracked. I told him you had a lot of fun. He looked pleased. Tell me exactly what he said and your exact answer. We spent the rest of the walk dissecting sentence structures and most of Spanish on a minute description of Mike's facial expressions. I wouldn't have helped draw it out for as long as I did if it wasn't worried about the subject returning to me. And then the bell rang for lunch. As I jumped up out of my seat, shoving my books roughly in my bag, my uplifted expression must have tipped Jessica off. You're not sitting with us today, are you? She guessed. I don't think so. I couldn't be sure that he wouldn't disappear inconveniently again. But outside the door to our Spanish class, leaning against the wall, looking more like a Greek god than anyone had a right to, Edward was waiting for me. Jessica took one look, rolled her eyes, and departed. See you later, Bella. Her voice was thick with implications. I might have to turn off the ringer on the phone. Hello. His voice was amused and irritated at the same time. He had been listening, it was obvious. Hi. I couldn't think of anything else to say, and he didn't speak, biding his time, I presumed, so it was a quiet walk to the cafeteria. Walking with Edward through the crowded lunchtime rush was a lot like my first day here. Everyone stared. He led the way into the line, still not speaking, though his eyes returned to my face every few seconds, their expression speculative. It seemed to me that irritation was winning out over amusement as the dominant emotion in his face. I fidgeted nervously with the zipper on my jacket. He stepped up to the counter and filled a tray with food. What are you doing? I objected. You're not getting all that for me. He shook his head, stepping forward to buy the food. Half is for me, of course. I raised one eyebrow. He led the way to the same place we'd sat that one time before. From the other end of the long table, a group of seniors gazed at us in amazement as we sat across from each other. Edward seemed oblivious. Take whatever you want, he said, pushing the tray toward me. I'm curious, I said as I picked up an apple, turning it around in my hands. What would you do if someone dared you to eat food? You're always curious. He grimaced, shaking his head. He glared at me, holding my eyes as he lifted the slice of pizza off the tray and deliberately bit off a mouthful, chewed quickly, and then swallowed. I watched, eyes wide. If someone dared you to eat dirt, you could, couldn't you? He asked condescendingly. I wrinkled my nose. I did once, on a dare, I admitted. It wasn't so bad. He laughed. I suppose I'm not surprised. Something over my shoulder seemed to catch his attention. Jessica's analyzing everything I do. She'll break it down for you later. He pushed the rest of the pizza toward me. The mention of Jessica brought a hint of his former irritation back to his features. I put down the apple and took a bite of the pizza, looking away, knowing he was about to start. So the waitress was pretty, was she? He asked casually. You really didn't notice? No, I wasn't paying attention. I had a lot on my mind. Poor girl. I could afford to be generous now. Something you said to Jessica. Well, it bothers me. He refused to be distracted. His voice was husky, and he glanced up from under his lashes with troubled eyes. I'm not surprised you heard something you didn't like. You know what they say about eavesdroppers, I reminded him. I warned you I would be listening. And I warned you that you didn't want to know everything I was thinking. You did. He agreed, but his voice was still rough. You aren't precisely right, though. I do want to know what you're thinking. Everything. I just wish that you wouldn't be thinking some things. I scowled. That's quite a distinction. But that's not really the point at the moment. Then what is? We were inclined toward each other across the table now. He had his large white hands folded under his chin. I leaned forward, my right hand cupped around my neck. I had to remind myself that we were in a crowded lunchroom with probably many curious eyes on us. It was too easy to get wrapped up in our own private, tense little bubble. Do you truly believe that you care more for me than I do for you? He murmured, leaning closer to me as he spoke, his dark golden eyes piercing. I tried to remember how to exhale. I had to look away before it came back to me. You're doing it again, I muttered. His eyes opened wide with surprise. What? Dazzling me, I admitted, trying to concentrate as I looked back at him. Oh, he frowned. It's not your fault, I sighed. You can't help it. Are you going to answer the question? I looked down. Yes. Yes, you're going to answer, or yes, you really think that? He was irritated again. Yes, I really think that. I kept my eyes down on the table, my eyes tracing the pattern of the faux wood grains printed on the laminate. The silence dragged on. I stubbornly refused to be the first to break it this time, fighting hard against the temptation to peek at his expression. Finally, he spoke, voice velvet soft. You're wrong. I glanced up to see that his eyes were gentle. You can't know that, I disagreed in a whisper. I shook my head in doubt, though my heart throbbed at his words, and I wanted so badly to believe them. What makes you think so? His liquid topaz eyes were penetrating, trying futilely, I assumed, to lift the truth straight from my mind. I stared back, struggling to think clearly in spite of his face, to find some way to explain. As I searched for the words, I could see him getting impatient, frustrated by my silence. He started to scowl. I lifted my hand from my neck and held up one finger. Let me think, I insisted. His expression cleared, now that he was satisfied that I was planning to answer. I dropped my hand to the table, moving my left hand so that my palms were pressed together. I stared at my hands, twisting and untwisting my fingers as I finally spoke. Well, aside from the obvious, sometimes, I hesitated. Can't be sure. I don't know how to read minds, but sometimes it seems like you're trying to say goodbye when you're saying something else. That was the best I could sum it up, the sensation of anguish that his words triggered in me at times. Perceptive, he whispered, and there was the anguish again, surfacing as he confirmed my fear. That's exactly why you're wrong, though. He began to explain, but then his eyes narrowed. What do you mean, the obvious? Well, look at me, I said unnecessarily as he was already staring. I'm absolutely ordinary. Well, except for the bad things, like all the near-death experiences and being so clumsy that I'm almost disabled. And look at you. I waved my hand toward him in all his bewildering perfection. His brow creased angrily for a moment, then smoothed that his eyes took on a knowing look. You don't see yourself very clearly, you know. I'll admit, you're dead on about the bad things. He chuckled blackly. But you didn't hear what every human male in this school was thinking on your first day. I blinked, astonished. I don't believe it, I mumbled to myself. Trust me just this once. You are the opposite of ordinary. My embarrassment was much stronger than my pleasure at the look that came into his eyes when he said this. I quickly reminded him of my original argument. But I'm not saying goodbye, I pointed out. Don't you see? That's what proves me right. I care the most because if I can do it. He shook his head, seeming to struggle with the thought. If leaving is the right thing to do, then I'll hurt myself to keep from hurting you, to keep you safe. I glared. And you don't think I would do the same? You'd never have to make the choice. Abruptly, his unpredictable mood shifted again. A mischievous, devastating smile rearranged his features. Of course, keeping you safe is beginning to feel like a full-time occupation that requires my constant presence. No one has tried to do away with me today, I reminded him, grateful for the lighter subject. I didn't want him to talk about goodbyes anymore. If I had to, I supposed I could purposefully put myself in danger to keep him close. I banished that thought before his quick eyes read it on my face. That idea would definitely get me in trouble. Yet, he added. Yet, I agreed. I would have argued, but now I wanted him to be expecting disasters. I have another question for you. His face was still casual. Shoot. Do you really need to go to Seattle this Saturday? Or was that just an excuse to get out of saying no to all your admirers? I made a face at the memory. You know, I haven't forgiven you for the Tyler thing yet, I warned him. It's your fault that he's deluded himself into thinking I'm going to prom with him. Oh, he would have found a chance to ask you without me. I just really wanted to watch your face. He chuckled. I would have been angrier if his laughter wasn't so fascinating. If I'd asked you, would you have turned me down? He asked, still laughing to himself. Probably not, I admitted. But I would have canceled later, faked an illness or a sprained ankle. He was puzzled. Why would you do that? I shook my head sadly. You've never seen me in gym, I guess, but I would have thought you would understand. Are you referring to the fact that you can't walk across a flat, stable surface without finding something to trip over? Obviously. That wouldn't be a problem. He was very confident. It's all in the leading. He could see that I was about to protest, and he cut me off. But you never told me. Are you resolved on going to Seattle? Or do you mind if we do something different? As long as the we part was in, I didn't care about anything else. I'm open to alternatives, I allowed, but I do have a favor to ask. He looked wary, as he always did when I asked an open-ended question. What? Can I drive? He frowned. Why? Well, mostly because when I told Charlie I was going to Seattle, he specifically asked if I was going alone, and at the time, I was. If he asked again, I probably wouldn't lie, but I don't think he will ask again, and leaving my truck at home would just bring up the subject unnecessarily. And also, because your driving frightens me. He rolled his eyes. Of all the things about me that could frighten you, you worry about my driving. He shook his head in disgust, but then his eyes were serious again. Won't you want to tell your father that you're spending the day with me? There was an undercurrent to his question that I didn't understand. With Charlie, less is always more. I was definite about that. Where are we going, anyway? The weather will be nice, so I'll be staying out of the public eye. And you can stay with me, if you'd like to. Again, he was leaving the choice up to me. And you'll show me what you meant about the sun? I asked, excited by the idea of unraveling another of the unknowns. Yes. He smiled, and then paused. But if you don't want to be alone with me, I'd still rather you didn't go to Seattle by yourself. I shudder to think of the trouble you could find in a city that size. I was miffed. Phoenix is 3 times bigger than Seattle, just in population, in physical size. But apparently, he interrupted me. Your number wasn't up in Phoenix, so I'd rather you stayed near me. His eyes did that unfair smoldering thing again. I couldn't argue with the eyes or the motivation, and it was a moot point anyways. As it happens, I don't mind being alone with you. I know, he said, sighed, brooding. You should tell Charlie, though. Why in the world would I do that? His eyes were suddenly fierce. To give me some small incentive to bring you back. I gulped, but after a moment of thought, I was sure. I think I'll take my chances. He exhaled angrily and looked away. Let's talk about something else, I suggested. What do you want to talk about? He asked. He was still annoyed. I glanced around us, making sure we were well out of anyone's hearing. As I cast my eyes around the room, I caught the eyes of his sister, Alice, staring at me. The others were looking at Edward. I looked away, swiftly, back to him, and he asked the first thing that came to mind. Why did you go to that Goat Rocks place last weekend? To hunt? Charlie said it wasn't a good place to hike because of bears. He stared at me as if I was missing something very obvious. Bears? I gasped, and he smirked. Bears are not in season, I added sternly to hide my shock. If you read carefully, the laws only cover hunting with weapons, he informed me. He watched my face with enjoyment as that slowly sank in. Bears, I repeated with difficulty. Grizzly is Emmett's favorite. His voice was still offhand, but his eyes were scrutinizing my reaction. I tried to pull myself together. I said, taking another bite of pizza as an excuse to look down. I chewed slowly and then took a long drink of Coke without looking up. So, I said after a moment, finally meeting his now anxious gaze, what's your favorite? He raised an eyebrow and the corners of his mouth turned down in disapproval. Mountain lion. Ah, I said in a politely disinterested tone, looking for my soda again. Of course, he said, and his tone mirrored mine. We have to be careful not to impact the environment with injudicious hunting. We try to focus on areas with an overpopulation of predators, ranging as far away as we need. There's always plenty of deer and elk here, and they'll do, but where's the fun in that? He smiled teasingly. Where indeed? I murmured around another bite of pizza. Early spring is Emmett's favorite bear season. They're just coming out of hibernation, so they're more irritable. He smiled at some remembered joke. Nothing more fun than an irritated grizzly bear, I agreed, nodding. He snickered, shaking his head. Tell me what you're really thinking, please. I'm trying to picture it, but I can't, I admitted. How do you hunt a bear without weapons? Oh, we have weapons. He flashed his bright teeth in a brief, threatening smile. I fought back a shiver before it could expose me. Just not the kind they consider when writing hunting laws. If you've ever seen a bear attack on television, you should be able to visualize Emmett hunting. I couldn't stop the next shiver that flashed down my spine. I peeked across the cafeteria toward Emmett, grateful that he wasn't looking my way. The thick bands of muscle that wrapped his arms and torso were somehow even more menacing now. Edward followed my gaze and chuckled. I stared at him, unnerved. "Are you like a bear, too?" I asked in a low voice. "More like the lion, or so they tell me," he said lightly. "Perhaps our preferences are indicative." I tried to smile. "Perhaps," I repeated, but my mind was filled with opposing images that I couldn't merge together. "Is that something I might get to see?" "Absolutely not." His face turned even whiter than usual, and his eyes were suddenly furious. I leaned back, stunned and, though I had never admitted to him, frightened by his reaction. He leaned back as well, folding his arms across his chest. "Too scary for me?" I asked when I could control my voice again. "If that were it, I would take you out tonight," he said, his voice cutting. "You need a healthy dose of fear. Nothing could be more beneficial for you." "Then why?" I pressed, trying to ignore his angry expression. He glared at me for a long minute. "Later," he finally said. He was on his feet in one lithe movement. "We're going to be late." I glanced around, started to see that he was right, and the cafeteria was nearly vacant. When I was with him, the time and the place were such a muddled blur that I completely lost track of both. I jumped up, grabbing my bag from the back of my chair. "Later, then," I agreed. I wouldn't forget. Chapter 11. Complications. Everyone watched us as we walked together to our lab table. I noticed that he no longer angled the chair to sit as far from me as the desk would allow. Instead, he sat quite close beside me, our arms almost touching. Mr. Banner backed into the room then, what superb timing the man had, pulling a tall metal frame on wheels that held a heavy-looking, outdated TV and VCR. A movie day. The lift in the class atmosphere was almost tangible. Mr. Banner shoved the tape into the reluctant VCR and walked to the wall to turn off the lights. And then, as the room went black, I was suddenly hyper-aware that Edward was sitting less than an inch from me. I was stunned by the unexpected electricity that flowed through me, amazed that it was possible to be more aware of him than I already was. A crazy impulse to reach over and touch him, to stroke his perfect face just once in the darkness, nearly overwhelmed me. I crossed my arms tightly across my chest, my hands balling into fist. I was losing my mind. The opening credits began, lighting the room by a token amount. My eyes, of their own accord, flickered to him. I smiled sheepishly as I realized his posture was identical to mine, fists clenched under his arms, right down to the eyes, peering sideways at me. He grinned back, his eyes somehow managing to smolder, even in the dark. I looked away before I could start hyperventilating. It was absolutely ridiculous that I should feel dizzy. The hours seemed very long. I couldn't concentrate on the movie. I didn't even know what subject it was on. I tried unsuccessfully to relax, but the electric current that seemed to be originating from somewhere in his body never slackened. Occasionally, I would permit myself a quick glance in his direction, but he never seemed to relax either. The overpowering craving to touch him also refused to fade, and I crushed my fist safely against my ribs until my fingers were aching with the effort. I breathed a sigh of relief when Mr. Banner flicked the lights back on at the end of class, and stretched my arms out in front of me, flexing my stiff fingers. Edward chuckled beside me. "Well, that was interesting," he murmured. His voice was dark and his eyes were cautious. Was all I was able to respond. "Shall we?" he asked, rising fluidly. I almost groaned. Time for gym. I stood with care, worried my balance might have been affected by the strange new intensity between us. He walked me to my next class in silence and paused at the door. I turned to say goodbye. His face startled me. His expression was torn, almost pained, and so fiercely beautiful that the ache to touch him flared as strong as before. My goodbye stuck in my throat. He raised his hand, hesitant, conflict raging in his eyes, and then swiftly brushed the length of my cheekbone with his fingertips. His skin was as icy as ever, but the trail his fingers left on my skin was alarmingly warm, like I'd been burned, but I didn't feel the pain of it yet. He turned without a word and strode quickly away from me. I walked into the gym, lightheaded and wobbly. I drifted to the locker room, changing in a trance-like state, only vaguely aware that there were other people surrounding me. Reality didn't fully set in until I was handed a racket. It wasn't heavy, yet it felt very unsafe in my hand. I could see a few of the other kids in the class eyeing me furtively. Coach Clapp ordered us to pair up into teams. Mercifully, some vestiges of Mike's chivalry still survived. He came to stand beside me. "Do you want to be a team?" "Thanks, Mike. You don't have to do this, you know." I grimaced apologetically. "Don't worry. I'll keep out of your way." He grinned. Sometimes it was so easy to like Mike. It didn't go smoothly. I somehow managed to hit myself in the head with my racket and clip Mike's shoulder on the same swing. I spent the rest of the hour in the back corner of the court, the racket held safely behind my back. Despite being handicapped by me, Mike was pretty good. He won 3 games out of 4 single-handedly. He gave me an unearned high five when the coach finally blew the whistle ending class. "So," he said as we walked off the court. "So what?" "You and Cullen, huh?" he asked, his tone rebellious. My previous feeling of affection disappeared. "That's none of your business, Mike," I warned, internally cursing Jessica straight to the fiery pits of Hades. "I don't like it," he muttered anyway. "You don't have to," I snapped. "He looks at you like you're something to eat," he continued, ignoring me. I choked back the hysteria that threatened to explode, but a small giggle managed to get out despite my efforts. He glowered at me. I waved and fled to the locker room. I dressed quickly, something stronger than butterflies batting recklessly against the walls of my stomach, my argument with Mike already a distant memory. I was wondering if Edward would be waiting, or if I should meet him at his car. What if his family was there? I felt a wave of real terror. Do they know that I know? Was I supposed to know that they knew that I knew, or not? By the time I walked out of the gym, I was just about decided to walk straight home without even looking toward the parking lot. But my worries were unnecessary. Edward was waiting, leaning casually against the side of the gym, his breathtaking face untroubled now. As I walked to his side, I felt a peculiar sense of release. "Hi," I breathed, smiling hugely. "Hello." His answering smile was brilliant. I was Jim. My face fell a tiny bit. "Fine," I lied. "Really?" He was unconvinced. His eyes shifted their focus slightly, looking over my shoulder and narrowing. I glanced behind me to see Mike's back as he walked away. His eyes slid back to mine, still tight. "What?" I demanded. "Newton's getting on my nerves." "You weren't listening again?" I was horror-struck. All traces of my sudden good humor vanished. "How's your head?" he asked innocently. "You're unbelievable." I turned, stomping away in the general direction of the parking lot, though I hadn't ruled out walking at this point. He kept up with me easily. "You were the one who mentioned how I'd never seen you in gym. It made me curious." He didn't sound repentant, so I ignored him. We walked in silence, a furious, embarrassed silence on my part, to his car. But I had to stop a few steps away. A crowd of people, all boys, were surrounding it. Then I realized they weren't surrounding the Volvo. They were actually circled around Rosalie's red convertible, unmistakable lust in their eyes. None of them even looked up as Edward slid between them to open his door. I climbed quickly in the passenger side, also unnoticed. "Ostentatious," he muttered. "What kind of car is that?" I asked. "An M3. I don't speak car and driver. It's a BMW. He rolled his eyes, not looking at me, trying to back out without running over the car enthusiast. I nodded. "I heard of that one." "Are you still angry?" he asked as he carefully maneuvered his way out. "Definitely." He sighed. "Will you forgive me if I apologize?" "Maybe, if you mean it. And if you promise not to do it again," I insisted. His eyes were suddenly shrewd. "How about if I mean it, and I agree to let you drive Saturday?" He countered my conditions. I considered and decided it was probably the best offer I would get. "Deal," I agreed. "Then I'm very sorry I upset you." His eyes burned with sincerity for a protracted moment, playing havoc with the rhythm of my heart, and then turned playful. "And I'll be on your doorstep bright and early, Saturday morning." It doesn't help with the Charlie situation if an unexplained Volvo is left in the driveway." His smile was condescending now. "I wasn't intending to bring a car." "How?" He cut me off. "Don't worry about it. I'll be there. No car." I let it go. I had a more pressing question. "Is it later yet?" I asked significantly. He frowned. "I suppose it is later." I kept my expression polite as I waited. He stopped the car. I looked up, surprised. Of course we were already at Charlie's house, parked behind the truck. It was easier to ride with him if I only looked when it was over. When I looked back at him, he was staring at me, measuring with his eyes. "And you still want to know why you can't see me hunt?" He seemed solemn, but I thought I saw a trace of humor deep in his eyes. Well, I clarified. I was mostly wondering about your reaction. Did I frighten you? Yes, there was definitely humor there. No, I lied. He didn't buy it. I apologize for scaring you. He persisted with a slight smile, but then all evidence of teasing disappeared. It was just the very thought of you being there while we hunted. His jaw tightened. That would be bad? He spoke from between clenched teeth. Extremely. Because he took a deep breath and stared through the windshield at the thick, rolling clouds that seemed to press down, almost within reach. When we hunt, he spoke slowly, unwillingly, we give ourselves over to our senses, govern less with our minds, especially our sense of smell. If you were anywhere near me when I lost control that way. He shook his head, still gazing morosely at the heavy clouds. I kept my expression firmly under control, expecting the swift flash of his eyes to judge my reaction that soon followed. My face gave nothing away. But our eyes held, and the silence deepened and changed. Flickers of the electricity I'd felt this afternoon began to charge the atmosphere as he gazed unrelentingly into my eyes. It wasn't until my head started to swim that I realized I wasn't breathing. When I drew in a jagged breath, breaking the stillness, he closed his eyes. Bella, I think you should go inside now. His low voice was rough, his eyes on the clouds again. I opened the door, and the arctic draft that burst into the car helped clear my head. Afraid I might stumble into my woozy state, I stepped carefully out of the car and shut the door behind me without looking back. The whir of the automatic window unrolling made me turn. Oh, Bella. He called after me, his voice more even. He leaned toward the open window with a faint smile on his lips. Yes? Tomorrow it's my turn. Your turn to what? He smiled wider, flashing his gleaming teeth. Ask the questions. And then he was gone, the car speeding down the street and disappearing around the corner before I could even collect my thoughts. I smiled as I walked to the house. It was clear he was planning to see me tomorrow, if nothing else. That night, Edward starred in my dreams as usual. However, the climate of my unconsciousness had changed. It thrilled with the same electricity that had charged the afternoon, and I tossed and turned restlessly, waking often. It was only in the early hours of the morning that I finally sank into an exhausted, dreamless sleep. When I woke, I was still tired, but edgy as well. I pulled on my brown turtleneck and the inescapable jeans, sighing as I daydreamed of spaghetti straps and shorts. Breakfast was the usual, quiet event I expected. Charlie fried eggs for himself. I had my bowl of cereal. I wondered if he had forgotten about this Saturday. He answered my unspoken question as he stood up to take his plate to the sink. About this Saturday, he began, walking across the kitchen and turning on the faucet. I cringed. Yes, Dad. Are you still set on going to Seattle? He asked. That was the plan. I grimaced, wishing he hadn't brought it up so I wouldn't have to compose careful half-truths. He squeezed some dish soap onto his plate and swirled it around with the brush. And you're sure you can't make it back in time for the dance? I'm not going to the dance, Dad. I glared. Didn't anyone ask you? He asked, trying to hide his concern by focusing on rinsing the plate. I sidestepped the minefield. It's a girl's choice. Oh. He frowned as he dried his plate. I sympathized with him. It must be a hard thing to be a father, living in fear that your daughter would meet a boy she liked, but also having to worry if she didn't. How ghastly it would be, I thought, shuddering, if Charlie had even the slightest inkling of exactly what I did like. Charlie left then, with a goodbye wave, and I went upstairs to brush my teeth and gather my books. When I heard the cruiser pull away, I could only wait a few seconds before I had to peek out of my window. The silver car was already there, waiting in Charlie's spot on the driveway. I bounded down the stairs and out the front door, wondering how long this bizarre routine would continue. I never wanted it to end. He waited in the car, not appearing to watch as I shut the door behind me without bothering to lock the deadbolt. I walked to the car, pausing shyly before opening the door and stepping in. He was smiling, relaxed, and, as usual, perfect and beautiful to an excruciating degree. Good morning. His voice was silky. How are you today? His eyes roamed over my face as if his question was something more than simple courtesy. Good, thank you. I was always good, much more than good, when I was near him. His gaze lingered on the circles under my eyes. You look tired. I couldn't sleep. I confessed, automatically swinging my hair around my shoulder to provide some measure of cover. Neither could I, he teased as he started the engine. I was becoming used to the quiet purr. I was sure the roar of my truck would scare me whenever I got to drive it again. I laughed. I guess that's right, I suppose. I slept just a little bit more than you did. I would wager you did. So, what did you do last night? I asked. He chuckled. Not a chance. It's my day to ask questions. Oh, that's right. What do you want to know? My forehead creased. I couldn't imagine anything about me that could be in any way interesting to him. What's your favorite color? He asked, his face grave. I rolled my eyes. It changes from day to day. What's your favorite color today? He was still solemn. Probably brown. I tended to dress according to my mood. He snorted, dropping a serious expression. Brown? He asked skeptically. Sure. Brown is warm. I miss brown. Everything that's supposed to be brown, tree trunks, rocks, dirt, is all covered up with squashy green stuff here, I complained. He seemed fascinated by my little rant. He considered for a moment, staring into my eyes. You're right, he decided, serious again. Brown is warm. He reached over, swiftly, but somehow still hesitantly, to sweep my hair back behind my shoulder. We were at the school by now. He turned back to me as he pulled into a parking space. What music is in your CD player right now? He asked, his face as somber as if he'd asked for a murder confession. I realized I'd never removed the CD Phil had given me. When I said the name of the band, he smiled crookedly, a peculiar expression in his eyes. He flipped open a compartment under his car's CD player, pulled out one of 30 or so CDs that were jammed into the small space, and handed it to me. Debussy to this. He raised an eyebrow. It was the same CD. I examined the familiar cover art, keeping my eyes down. It continued like that for the rest of the day. While he walked me to English when he met me after Spanish, all through the lunch hour, he questioned me relentlessly about every insignificant detail of my existence. Movies I had liked and hated, the few places I'd been and the many places I wanted to go, and books. Endlessly books. I couldn't remember the last time I'd talked so much. More often than not, I felt self-conscious, certain I must be boring him. But the absolute absorption of his face and his never-ending stream of questions compelled me to continue. Mostly his questions were easy, only a very few triggering my easy blushes, but when I did flush, they brought on a whole new round of questions. Such as the time he asked my favorite gemstone, and I blurted out topaz before thinking. He'd been flinging questions at me with such speed that I felt like I was taking one of those psychiatric tests where you answer with the first word that comes to mind. I was sure he would have continued down whatever mental list he was following, except for the blush. My face reddened because, until very recently, my favorite gemstone was garnet. It was impossible, while staring back into his topaz eyes, not to remember the reason for the switch. And naturally, he wouldn't rest until I had admitted why I was embarrassed. Tell me, he finally commanded after persuasion failed. Failed only because I kept my eyes safely away from his face. It's the color of your eyes today, I sighed, surrendering, staring down at my hands as I fiddled with a piece of my hair. I suppose if you asked me in 2 weeks, I'd say onyx. I had given more information than necessary in my unwilling honesty, and I worried it would provoke the strange anger that flared whenever I slipped and revealed too clearly how obsessed I was. But his pause was very short. What kind of flowers do you prefer? He fired off. I sighed in relief and continued with the psychoanalysis. Biology was a complication again. Edward had continued with his quizzing up until Mr. Banner entered the room, dragging the audiovisual frame again. As the teacher approached the light switch, I noticed Edward slide his chair slightly further away from mine. It didn't help. As soon as the room was dark, there was the same electric spark, the same restless craving to stretch my hand across the short space and touch his cold skin, as yesterday. I leaned forward on the table, resting my chin on my folded arms, my hidden fingers gripping the table's edge as I fought to ignore the irrational longing that unsettled me. I didn't look at him, afraid that if he was looking at me, it would only make self-control that much harder. I sincerely tried to watch the movie, but at the end of the hour, I had no idea what I'd just seen. I sighed in relief again when Mr. Banner turned the lights on, finally glancing at Edward. He was looking at me, his eyes ambivalent. He rose in silence and then stood still, waiting for me. We walked toward the gym in silence, like yesterday. And also, like yesterday, he touched my face wordlessly, this time with the back of his cool hand, stroking once from my temple to my jaw, before he turned and walked away. Jim passed quickly as I watched Mike's one-man badminton show. He didn't speak to me today, either in response to my vacant expression or because he was still angry about our squabble yesterday. Somewhere, in a corner of my mind, I felt bad about that, but I couldn't concentrate on him. I hurried to change afterward, ill at ease, knowing the faster I moved, the sooner I would be with Edward. The pressure made me more clumsy than usual, but eventually I made it out the door, feeling the same release when I saw him standing there, a wide smile automatically spreading across my face. He smiled in reaction before launching into more cross-examination. His questions were different now, though, not as easily answered. He wanted to know what I missed about home, insisting on descriptions of anything he wasn't familiar with. We sat in front of Charlie's house for hours, as the sky darkened and rain plummeted around us in a sudden deluge. I tried to describe impossible things like the scent of creosote, bitter, slightly resinous, but still pleasant, the high, keening sound of the cicadas in July, the feathery barrenness of the trees, the very size of the sky, extending white blue from horizon to horizon, barely interrupted by the low mountains covered with purple volcanic rock. The hardest thing to explain was why it was so beautiful to me, to justify a beauty that didn't depend on the sparse, spiny vegetation that often looked half dead, a beauty that had more to do with the exposed shape of the land, with the shallow bowls of valleys between the craggy hills, and the way they held onto the sun. I found myself using my hands as I tried to describe it to him. His quiet, probing questions kept me talking freely, forgetting in the dim light of the storm to be embarrassed for monopolizing in the conversation. Finally, when I had finished detailing my cluttered room at home, he paused instead of responding with another question. "Are you finished?" I asked in relief. "Not even close. But your father will be home soon." "Charlie!" I suddenly recalled his existence inside. I looked out at the rain-darkened sky, but it gave nothing away. "How late is it?" I wondered out loud as I glanced at the clock. I was surprised by the time. Charlie would be driving home now. "It's twilight," Edward murmured, looking at the western horizon, obscured as it was with clouds. His voice was thoughtful, as if his mind were somewhere far away. I stared at him when he gazed unseeingly out the windshield. I was still staring when his eyes suddenly shifted back to mine. "It's the safest time of day for us," he said, answering the unspoken question in my eyes. "The easiest time, but also the saddest, in a way. The end of another day, the return of the night. Darkness is so predictable, don't you think?" He smiled wistfully. "I like the night. Without the dark, we'd never see the stars." I frowned. "Not that you see them here much." He laughed, and the mood abruptly lightened. "Charlie will be here in a few minutes, so unless you want to tell him that you'll be with me Saturday." He raised one eyebrow. "Thanks, but no thanks." I gathered my books, realizing I was stiff from sitting still so long. "So, is it my turn tomorrow, then?" "Certainly not." His face was teasingly outraged. "I told you I wasn't done, didn't I?" "What more is there?" "You'll find out tomorrow." He reached across to open my door for me, and his sudden proximity sent my heart into frenzied palpitations. But his hand froze on the handle. "Not good," he muttered. "What is it?" I was surprised to see that his jaw was clenched, his eyes disturbed. He glanced at me for a brief second. "Another complication," he said glumly. He flung the door open in one swift movement, and then moved, almost cringed, swiftly away from me. The flash of headlights through the rain caught my attention as a dark car pulled up to the curb just a few feet away, facing us. "Charlie's around the corner," he warned, staring through the downpour at the other vehicle. I hopped out at once, despite my confusion and curiosity. The rain was louder as I glanced off my jacket. I tried to make out the shapes in the front seat of the other car, but it was too dark. I could see Edward illuminated in the glare of the new car's headlights. He was still staring ahead, his gaze locked on something or someone I couldn't see. His expression was a strange mix of frustration and defiance. Then he revved the engine, and the tires squealed against the wet pavement. The Volvo was out of sight in seconds. "Hey, Bella!" called a familiar, husky voice from the driver's side of the little black car. "Jacob?" I asked, squinting through the rain. Just then, Charlie's cruiser swung around the corner, his lights shining on the occupants of the car in front of me. Jacob was already climbing out, his wide grin visible even through the darkness. In the passenger seat was a much older man, a heavy-set man with a memorable face, a face that overflowed, the cheeks resting against his shoulders, with creases running through the rusted skin like an old leather jacket, and the surprisingly familiar eyes, black eyes that seemed at the same time both too young and too ancient for the broad face they were set in. Jacob's father, Billy Black. I knew him immediately, though in the more than 5 years since I'd seen him last, I'd managed to forget his name when Charlie had spoken of him the first day here. He was staring at me, scrutinizing my face, so I smiled tentatively at him. His eyes were wide, as if in shock or fear. His nostrils flared. My smile faded. Another complication, Edward had said. Billy still stared at me with intense, anxious eyes. I groaned internally. Had Billy recognized Edward so easily? Could he really believe the impossible legends his son had scoffed at? The answer was clear in Billy's eyes. Yes. Yes, he could. And that's where we're going to leave it off for today, so thank you guys so much for listening for this What a Book. If you liked it, make sure to check out everything else that is in the Linktree link, which if you follow, one will take you to the Twitch, the _soloist_2014, where I stream on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. The other will also take you to the YouTube channel, The Soloist, those are words, which contains its own set of games, as well as all old streams from Twitch a week after they air. You can also find all of my social media in that Linktree link. I'm on Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok. So thank you guys so much for listening. Tune in next week for What a Thought, where I'm still uncertain if I'm going to talk about Barbie and Oppenheimer or something else entirely. But I guess we'll see when we get there. So thank you guys again. I've been Matthew Allen, this has been What a Book, and I will see all of you next week.